A snow-covered village, a single scream, and a secret buried beneath the tinsel. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Arvela. This community is incredible. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your voices make these mysteries come alive. Let's dive in. The snow had come early to St. Mary Mead that year. Thick, soft and unhurried, like a curtain falling over the sleepy village lanes. Icicles clung to the thatched eaves, and the chimneys puffed out curls of wood smoke that mingled with the faint scent of pine and pudding spice. It was Christmas Eve, and every window in the village glowed with the kind of warmth that made outsiders believe nothing wicked could ever happen in such a place. At the vicarage, Mrs. Grayson was in a flurry of last-minute preparations. The annual Christmas Eve gathering had been her idea. Just a little festivity for the parish, you know, to bring everyone together. She had said it cheerily enough, though her husband, the Reverend Lionel Grayson, suspected that the purpose was less spiritual and more social. The vicarage drawing-room, festooned with holly and mistletoe, buzzed with the gentle chatter of guests warming themselves with punch and curiosity. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, flickered now and then toward the room's various corners, not intrusively, but with the keen bird-like attention of one who noticed everything. She had come as she always did, because she knew that Christmas gatherings revealed more truths about human nature than any police interview ever could. Among the guests were the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead Society. Colonel Arthur Melrose, retired and still convinced the world ran better under military discipline. Mrs. Sylvia Trent, recently widowed, her black dress adorned with a crimson ribbon that struck some as too festive for mourning. Mr. Julian Harper, a writer from London renting a cottage nearby for peace and inspiration, though the village suspected romance had more to do with it, and Miss Violet Cummings, the vicar's cousin, a sharp-tongued spinster with opinions on everything and everyone. Conversation was pleasant enough, though it hummed with the undercurrents of small-town intrigue. A rumour here, a hint there, all wrapped neatly in polite smiles. Miss Marple listened, her needles never missing a beat. Then, as the clock struck 8, the door burst open with a gust of icy wind. A young maid, Mary, pale as the snow outside, stumbled in. Her voice trembled. "Beg pardon, ma'am. It's Mr. Leonard. He's been found in the stable, and he's dead." The room froze. Mrs. Grayson gasped, dropping her teacup. Colonel Melrose barked something about calling the police. Only Miss Marple did not move. Her knitting slowed, then stopped entirely. Her expression remained calm, almost reflective. "Mr. Leonard," she murmured softly, as if testing the name against memory. "The solicitor's clerk, wasn't he? How very curious. Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The village reacts where gossip begins to spread, and the first suspicions take shape. The news of Mr. Leonard's death spread through St. Mary Mead, faster than the cold wind that whipped through its narrow lanes. By the following morning, whispers had become conversations, and conversations had turned into elaborate theories. Each villager seemed to know precisely what had happened, though none could agree on how or why. At the vicarage, where the dreadful discovery had been made, the air was heavy with both grief and speculation. The body had been taken away before dawn, the police having arrived from Much Benham under the direction of Inspector Craddock, who now seemed a permanent fixture whenever something unfortunate occurred in the vicinity of Miss Marple. In the small drawing-room, a group had gathered once again, ostensibly to offer comfort, though comfort was the last thing on anyone's mind. Mrs. Grayson fluttered about, pale and nervous, wringing her hands as if the act might somehow wring the horror out of the house. Colonel Melrose stood by the hearth, his brows drawn. "Shot through the chest," he declared to no one in particular. "Clean wound, not the work of an amateur. Whoever did it knew how to handle a firearm." His tone carried the weight of experience. Mrs. Trent, seated beside the tea service, gave a delicate shiver. "How dreadful! And on Christmas Eve, too. I saw him only yesterday in the post office. So polite, though rather distracted. I suppose one never knows what troubles a person carries, do they?" She looked around meaningfully, as though expecting a confession. Miss Marple, who sat quietly in a corner, was sipping her tea with great care. Her eyes wandered from speaker to speaker, noting the tightness in Mrs. Grayson's smile, the way Colonel Melrose's fingers tapped the mantelpiece, the faint tremor in Miss Cummings's voice as she added, "It's unnatural, that's what it is. Such things don't happen here. Of course one can't be sure about outsiders. He was only renting, wasn't he?" "Working for Mr. Hawthorne, the solicitor," Mrs. Grayson replied, "helping with the estate papers for the late Sir Geoffrey Denham. He'd been here about 3 months. Such a nice, quiet man. Why, he even helped me mend the church accounts." "Accounts, you say?" Colonel Melrose grunted. "Motive enough sometimes." A silence followed, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Miss Marple's needles moved again, slow and deliberate. "People rarely kill for numbers, Colonel," she said mildly, "though sometimes numbers tell us who might be tempted." The Colonel frowned, not quite sure if she had contradicted him or agreed. Meanwhile, the maid Mary, still shaken from her discovery, was giving her statement in the kitchen to a young constable. The word about the stable had circulated already. Mr. Leonard had gone out to fetch a parcel from the carriage house some time after 7. The light was dim, and it seemed he had been alone. There was no sign of robbery. His watch and wallet were found intact. The gun had not been found at all. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly thereafter, brushing snow from his coat. His expression was grim but composed. "Unpleasant business," he muttered as he entered the room. "I'll need statements from everyone who was here last night." His gaze swept across the group, lingering for a moment on Miss Marple, who greeted him with her usual calm civility. "Good morning, Inspector. I suppose you've had little sleep," she said kindly. "None at all, Miss Marple. These holiday cases never come at a convenient hour." "Crime rarely does," she replied softly, returning to her knitting. Craddock took a seat and began his inquiries. The sequence of the evening's events unfolded with predictable similarity. The party had begun at 6. Refreshments were served. Carols were sung. Mr. Leonard had been cheerful enough, though more subdued than usual. Around 7:30, he had excused himself, saying he had forgotten something in his bag out by the stable. He never returned. No one followed him. The inspector asked. "No one," answered the vicar. "I remember hearing the back door close, and then nothing until Mary came running in." Craddock nodded, making notes. "Anyone hear a gunshot?" Several shook their heads. Colonel Melrose hesitated. There was a noise, a faint one. Could have been a car backfiring, though. "Hard to tell in this weather." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice gentle but precise. "The snow muffles sound, Inspector. Unless one is quite near, a pistol might make less noise than a kettle boiling." Craddock inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of it. "We'll search the grounds again for the weapon. It's likely been dropped or hidden close by." As he rose, Mrs. Trent leaned toward Miss Cummings, whispering behind her hand, "I do hope it wasn't that young writer, Mr. Harper. You know how temperamental artistic men can be. And he and Mr. Leonard had words last week, I heard." "Over the Christmas performance," Miss Cummings hissed back. Mr. Leonard said his play was unfit for the parish hall. Such arrogance! And now, well, there's no telling what passion might drive a man. Miss Marple did not look up, though she missed nothing. The faintest smile touched her lips, the kind that suggested she had already filed away the comment for later use. Passion is rarely the cause, she said, almost to herself. Hurt pride, perhaps, but that's quite another thing. The inspector left soon after, taking Colonel Melrose to assist with the search, while the rest of the guests began to drift away, subdued and unsettled. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering footprints as though nature herself wished to hide what had been done. Miss Marple lingered a while longer, tidying her knitting into her bag. "You know, my dear Mrs. Grayson," she said gently, "it's always the smallest things that tell the story. People often think in grand motives, jealousy, greed, revenge. But it's in the little habits, the tiny details, that truth lives. I dare say the answer will be found in something so ordinary that no one has thought to question it." Mrs. Grayson gave a nervous smile, unsure what to say. Miss Marple stepped into the hall, fastening her cloak. Through the frosted glass, she could see the stable in the distance, a faint dark shape against the white. Her eyes lingered on it for a long moment before she turned toward the door. "Christmas Eve," she murmured, pulling her shawl tighter. "A time for goodwill and reflection. And yet, how curious that human hearts can hide such dreadful things behind their celebrations." With that, she stepped out into the snow, her footsteps light and deliberate, already following the invisible trail that only she could see. Morning crept reluctantly over St. Mary Mead, pale and cold, with the snow still thick upon the ground. The village awoke under a shroud of quiet, disturbed only by the occasional rumble of a motor car making its way toward the vicarage, where Inspector Craddock had established his temporary headquarters. The townsfolk, pretending to go about their daily business, found every excuse to pass near the vicarage gate, hoping for a glimpse of authority or a scrap of rumour to feed their curiosity. News had spread that Mr. Leonard's death was not an accident as some had hoped, but deliberate murder, plain and chilling. The word hung in the frosted air like a curse. Miss Marple, having taken her breakfast of porridge and tea, walked through the village with her usual calm step. Her grey coat blended almost invisibly with the snow, her mind already turning over the fragments of conversation from the night before. She had observed much and spoken little, as was her way. Every remark, every uneasy glance, every silence weighed in her mind. She was not one to assume, for assumption, as she often said, was the mother of error. Instead, she compared. Every human action reminded her of some prior instance, some small village quarrel or moral failing that had, in the end, betrayed itself in much the same way. She paused before the greengrocer's, where two women were speaking in low but fervent tones. "They say he had papers on him," whispered one. "Legal ones, about Sir Geoffrey Denham's estate." "Something about a will, said the other, leaning closer. "Oh, mercy, I told you it'd be about money. Always is. They say Mrs. Denham might not get a penny if things were settled the wrong way." Miss Marple moved on quietly, not wishing to disturb the gossip, but she filed the detail away. Wills were delicate matters. They had a way of revealing the best and worst in people. At the vicarage, Inspector Craddock was pacing before the hearth, his notes spread across the table. "There's more to this than a simple shooting," he was saying to Colonel Melrose. "No sign of forced entry, no struggle. The shot was fired at close range. Whoever did it either knew him, or he trusted them. Which narrows it to nearly everyone here." The colonel grunted. "He wasn't the sort to make enemies." That we know of, Craddock replied. I've spoken to his employer, Mr. Hawthorne. Said Leonard was honest, methodical, and discreet, but he hinted the young man had been anxious these past few days. Said something about a matter of conscience. Miss Marple entered then, her presence so gentle that even Craddock, usually brisk, greeted her with a touch of respect. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You've come at just the right time. I was about to have a word with Mrs. Trent." "She'll tell you what she thinks you wish to hear, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, "though her choice of words may say more than she intends." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he smiled faintly. "You've the advantage of knowing them all, Miss Marple. I, on the other hand, must rely on statements. Statements are only words, Inspector. Truth is often found in the tone." Mrs. Trent entered soon after, impeccably dressed for morning once more, her eyes wide with an eagerness she mistook for composure. "Such a tragedy, Inspector. I've scarcely slept a wink. To think poor Mr. Leonard, so young and respectable. Do you have any notion of who might have done such a thing?" Craddock motioned her to sit. "You spoke with Mr. Leonard last evening, did you not?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Briefly, yes. About the charity accounts. He seemed distracted, I remember, though I thought little of it at the time. I asked if he would be attending the Christmas service, and he replied rather oddly. Something about having unfinished business. I thought it peculiar." Miss Marple, watching her closely, said softly, "I imagine you found that phrase unsettling, Mrs. Trent." The woman blinked. "Well, yes, naturally, but I assumed he meant work matters. He was handling Sir Geoffrey's estate after all, and that would affect many in the village, would it not?" Miss Marple's voice was innocent, almost airy. "Oh, I shouldn't say many, only those expecting something from the will. Though," she added quickly, "I've heard Miss Denham, Sir Geoffrey's niece, was rather disappointed. But of course one mustn't talk of such things." "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured, but her eyes glinted. When Mrs. Trent had gone, Craddock turned to her. "You think she's hiding something?" "Not hiding, Inspector, merely embellishing. A person's eagerness to appear innocent can be most revealing. She knows more about the Denham will than she admits." Craddock sighed. "Everyone in this village seems to know more than they admit. I've also heard that Mr. Leonard was seen speaking with Miss Denham 2 nights ago, rather late. You know how tongues wag here." "They wag because they have little else to do," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. "But sometimes gossip is only the distorted echo of truth." By afternoon, the snow had turned to a light drizzle, and the police had completed another search of the stable and grounds. No weapon was found, though footprints half melted suggested someone had come and gone through the rear gate leading towards the old orchard. Craddock was examining them when Miss Marple appeared again, wrapped in her shawl. "Curious, isn't it," she said, "how people forget that snow records more faithfully than any diary. Those footprints, see how the right one sinks deeper. Whoever made them was carrying something heavy. Perhaps the missing weapon." Craddock looked up sharply. "You've a good eye, Miss Marple. Just an old one, Inspector. Old eyes see what younger ones dismiss." As they returned toward the house, a voice called from behind. It was Violet Cummings, breathless and flushed. "Inspector, I must speak with you." "It's important, terribly important," Craddock turned. "What is it, Miss Cummings?" She hesitated, darting a glance at Miss Marple before speaking. "I saw Mr. Harper last night, after the party, near the churchyard. He was arguing with someone, quite heatedly. I couldn't see who, but I'm certain it was a man, and he had something in his hand, a dark shape, like a bag or maybe, well, it could have been a gun." The inspector's expression hardened. "You're sure of that?" "I am, Inspector. I didn't mention it sooner because, well, one doesn't like to spread tales." But after what's happened, she trailed off, wringing her hands. Miss Marple regarded her with quiet interest. You're quite right to come forward, my dear. It's brave to do so after the fact. Though one does wonder, she added softly, why you were near the churchyard yourself, so late in the cold. Miss Cummings stiffened. I was visiting my cousin's grave, of course. Christmas Eve, it's a sentimental time. Indeed, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly, and sentiment often leads us into the strangest places. As Violet hurried off, Craddock frowned. You don't believe her? I believe she saw something, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, but I do not believe she saw what she thinks she saw. People rarely do in the dark, Inspector, and sometimes they see precisely what they wish to. Craddock folded his notebook with a sigh. I'll have a word with Harper all the same. If he was near the scene, he'll have to explain why. As he strode away, Miss Marple looked once more toward the orchard, her expression unreadable. The drizzle had turned the snow to slush, and the footprints were already vanishing. She knew time erased clues as easily as conscience erased guilt. But unlike snow, human memory left impressions far deeper. She touched the gate latch lightly, feeling the cold metal under her fingers, and murmured, The past never truly buries its dead. It only waits for the curious to dig. Then she turned and followed the inspector back toward the vicarage, the faintest glimmer of understanding beginning to form behind her calm blue eyes. By the time dusk settled over St. Mary Mead that evening, the village was humming with quiet speculation. Curtains twitched, doors opened just wide enough for whispers to slip through, and every conversation began with, they say. The murder of Mr. Leonard had given the townsfolk a rare excitement. Fearful, yes, but irresistible. Yet for all their chatter, not a single person could claim to understand how or why the gentle solicitor's clerk had met his end. Only one person, it seemed, was content to observe rather than speculate. Miss Marple sat in her small parlour, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring into the faint glow of her fire. To anyone passing by her window, she might have appeared to be resting. In truth, her mind was as active as the inspector's entire constabulary. She had spent the afternoon revisiting the vicarage grounds, ostensibly to deliver a basket of scones to poor Mrs. Grayson, who, as Miss Marple suspected, would find comfort in both the gesture and the opportunity to talk. The vicar's wife had been all nerves, wringing her handkerchief and glancing repeatedly toward the window that overlooked the stable. I can't think how it happened, Miss Marple, she had said, her voice trembling. Mr. Leonard was so polite, always offering to help with church matters. He had such a nice way about him. Why, just last week, he told me he'd be spending Christmas Day alone. It seemed so sad, and now... Oh dear, it's dreadful to think what that meant. Alone, you say? Miss Marple had asked softly, her eyes thoughtful. And yet he attended your gathering. That's a curious sort of solitude. Mrs. Grayson had blinked. Well, yes, I suppose so. But he didn't seem lonely, just preoccupied. I thought it must be work. The estate business, you know. People have been saying dreadful things about Sir Geoffrey's will, though, of course, that's no concern of mine. Miss Marple had merely smiled and changed the subject, but the details stayed with her. A man who was to spend Christmas alone rarely attended parties out of duty. He attended out of necessity, or fear. Now, as the fire crackled softly, she considered the pattern beginning to form. Mr. Leonard had been anxious, burdened by something connected to the Denham estate. He had argued recently with the visiting playwright Julian Harper. He had spoken of unfinished business to Mrs. Trent, and his death had occurred scarcely half an hour later. The pistol was still missing, and then there was Violet Cummings's supposed sighting near the churchyard. a sighting that, Miss Marple felt certain, was less about truth and more about self-protection. Her musings were interrupted by a brisk knock on the door. When she opened it, Inspector Craddock stood there, his expression weary but resolute. "Good evening, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I must intrude once more. We've found something." She stepped aside to let him in, her eyes brightening slightly. "Something, Inspector, is often more useful than everything." He handed her a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a glove. Brown leather, damp and faintly stained with something dark. It was caught in the hedgerow near the orchard path. Men are checking whether it's Mr. Leonard's. There's a mark on the wrist, J.H. in gold letters. "Julian Harper," Miss Marple murmured almost to herself. Craddock nodded. "It points that way. And there's more. One of the villagers claims Harper visited Mr. Leonard at his lodgings earlier that day. Loud voices were heard. Apparently, the argument concerned a letter Mr. Leonard refused to hand over." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "How very interesting. People seldom quarrel over letters unless their contents are either scandalous or valuable, and often both." Craddock sat down heavily. "I intend to bring him in for questioning. But between you and me, Miss Marple, something about this case feels off. Too neat, too quick to accuse. I can't shake the feeling we're being led toward the wrong conclusion." "That's very perceptive of you, Inspector," she said kindly. "Deception often works best when it resembles simplicity. Perhaps you might consider who benefits from such tidiness." Craddock frowned. "You think someone's framing Harper? And I think," she said gently, "that Mr. Harper may have been careless in more ways than one. But murder requires a degree of calm he may not possess. He is a man of impulse, not calculation, and this crime, I fear, was calculated." As if summoned by their discussion, there came another knock at the door, hurried, uneven. It was Mr. Harper himself, looking pale and dishevelled, his scarf trailing and his eyes wild with agitation. "Miss Marple, Inspector, thank heaven you're here. They're saying dreadful things about me, but I swear I had nothing to do with Leonard's death." "Nothing?" "Calm yourself, Mr. Harper," said Craddock sternly. "You'd best explain what you were doing near the churchyard last night." Harper looked startled. "Churchyard? I wasn't near any churchyard. I went home after the party, straight home. Ask anyone." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "People often think they've gone straight home, Mr. Harper, when in fact they've taken a small detour of conscience. Perhaps you were meeting someone." His jaw tightened. "No, yes, I did see Leonard earlier that day. He had a letter that concerned me, something from Miss Denham's uncle. It suggested I was interfering with family affairs. It was nonsense, of course. I only wanted him to return it. I didn't threaten him." Craddock leaned forward. "And when he refused, I left." Harper snapped. "He said he had responsibilities, that he wouldn't destroy legal property. That was the last I saw of him. I wouldn't harm him, Inspector. I give you my word." Miss Marple studied him with quiet interest. "And the glove, Mr. Harper, it bears your initials." He stared, bewildered. "I lost one yesterday morning on the lane to the post office. I didn't even realize. Are you saying it was found near where he died?" Craddock nodded grimly. Harper sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "This is absurd. Someone's trying to ruin me." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "People rarely ruin others without reason, Mr. Harper. Tell me, who knew of your quarrel with Mr. Leonard?" He hesitated. "Miss Cummings. She overheard us at the inn last week. She told me she wouldn't mention it, but, well, she likes to talk." Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched beside her. The needles crossed like twin daggers. "Indeed," she said softly, "and some talk not to reveal secrets, but to control how they're heard." Craddock rose. "We'll verify your story, Harper. Until then, I advise you to stay where you can be found." After he left, Miss Marple watched the man's trembling hands. "Fear and guilt often look the same from a distance," she murmured. "But fear, Mr. Harper, fades when one is innocent. Yours, I think, is fading already." He looked up, confused. "You believe me?" "I believe," she said with a faint smile, "that you are not nearly clever enough to have done this neatly, and whoever did it was very, very neat." When Harper had gone, Craddock lingered a moment longer by the door. "You think he's being framed?" "I think," Miss Marple replied quietly, "that a woman's hand is at work here, gentle, deliberate, and entirely underestimated. And that, Inspector, is far more dangerous than a man with a pistol." Outside the wind rose, scattering the last of the snow from the hedgerows. Somewhere in the dark, unseen, a single lantern burned behind drawn curtains, its light flickering against the frost like a secret refusing to stay buried. The following morning dawned grey and still, as if the village itself hesitated to breathe. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that crackled beneath the boots of those who dared to step outside. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, the kettle whistled softly, and the familiar scent of tea filled the room. She had slept little, not because of fear, but because her mind refused to rest. Every piece of the puzzle seemed nearly in place, yet one vital fragment remained hidden. One she suspected was being carefully kept from view. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after 9, his coat dusted with frost, his expression grim. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," she replied, motioning him toward the hearth. "You look as though you've spent the night in a snowdrift. Sit down and warm yourself. I'll fetch another cup." He accepted the offer with a tired smile. "We've made progress of sorts. The letter Harper mentioned, it's missing. We searched Leonard's lodgings this morning, and there's no sign of it. His papers were neatly arranged, his drawers locked, but one folder, the one marked Denham, had been emptied. Had Miss Marple poured the tea, her eyes thoughtful. So, a letter disappears, a man dies, and the one who had reason to want it gone swears innocence. That's rather suggestive, isn't it? Suggestive, yes, but not conclusive. Harper insists he never found the letter. Miss Denham, on the other hand, claims she has no knowledge of it. She seemed nervous, though. Frightened, perhaps. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, fear again. It's such a reliable barometer of guilt, though it often points in the wrong direction. Did you speak with Mr. Hawthorne?" "I did," Craddock replied. He confirmed Leonard was handling sensitive estate matters. There was confusion about Sir Geoffrey's true heir. A second will had been rumoured, one that might disinherit the niece entirely. Hawthorne said Leonard was honest, but he hinted the young man had begun asking uncomfortable questions. About money? Possibly. Or about people who wanted it. Miss Marple leaned back, the firelight flickering across her face. Then we must consider who had most to gain by his silence. Miss Denham, perhaps, or someone acting on her behalf. Though I wonder, Inspector, was she clever enough to plan such a thing herself? Before Craddock could reply, there came a soft knock on the door. It was Mary, the maid from the vicarage, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She clutched a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Grayson asked me to bring this to you. She said you might find it interesting." Miss Marple thanked her and set the parcel on the table. When the girl had gone, she untied the string. Inside was a small notebook, its cover scuffed and stained. The initials E.L. were faintly visible in faded ink. Craddock leaned forward. "Leonard's." Miss Marple opened it carefully. The first pages contained mundane notes about appointments and legal references. But halfway through a few lines were written in a hurried, uneven hand. Something wrong with the Denham papers. 2 versions, one genuine, one false. Must speak to H before it's too late. Can't trust everyone. She knows. Craddock exhaled slowly. That's it then. He discovered something about the will. Someone realized it and silenced him. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the final words. She knows. Yes, Inspector, but the question remains, who is she? Not Miss Denham, I think. He would have written her name plainly. He meant someone unexpected, someone he'd only just realized was involved. Craddock frowned. Mrs. Trent, perhaps? She's been altogether too curious. Or too confident, Miss Marple murmured. Confidence can be a mask, you know, the sort worn by those accustomed to deceiving politely. At that moment, the church bells rang faintly across the fields. The sound carried on the icy air. Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the faint outline of the vicarage was just visible beyond the trees. Inspector, I think it's time you called upon Mrs. Trent again. But this time let her believe she's not being questioned. Let her feel quite at ease. I've found that people reveal most when they think no one is listening. Half an hour later, they arrived at the Trent residence, a neat, ivy-clad house that seemed too cheerful for its owner's temperament. Mrs. Trent welcomed them with exaggerated warmth. Inspector! Miss Marple, do come in. I was just preparing tea. Terrible business, isn't it? I do hope you found the culprit. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. We're making progress, madam. I only wanted to clarify a small matter. You mentioned before that Mr. Leonard seemed troubled last night. Did he say anything that struck you as peculiar? Mrs. Trent hesitated, her hand resting on the teapot. Peculiar? Well, he was distracted. But then men often are when money's involved. He said something about the truth not being safe in the wrong hands. I thought it rather melodramatic. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her tone deceptively casual. Oh, I'm sure it was just a figure of speech. Though I wonder, my dear, where you came by that lovely brooch you're wearing. Such an unusual design. Mrs. Trent touched it instinctively. A gold filigree piece shaped like a bird in flight. This? Why, it was a gift. From an old friend. Years ago. Ah, yes, Miss Marple murmured. The kind of friend one never quite forgets. I only ask because I saw a sketch of something remarkably similar among Sir Geoffrey's belongings once. He was fond of such pieces, wasn't he? The woman stiffened almost imperceptibly. I wouldn't know, she said quickly. I hardly knew Sir Geoffrey. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Of course. When they left, Craddock turned to her the moment the door closed. What was that about? The brooch? Only that Sir Geoffrey had a penchant for giving his mistresses little tokens. Birds, usually. Freedom, I believe, was the symbol, and I dare say Mrs. Trent's claim of hardly knowing him was a trifle modest. Craddock's eyes widened. You think she was the she Leonard referred to? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that she had far more reason to fear discovery than anyone else. A second will, a secret affair, and perhaps a threat to expose both. Mr. Leonard may have been honest, but honesty, Inspector, is a dangerous quality in a dishonest world. As they walked back through the village, the wind rose again, carrying with it faint strains of a carol from the church. Soft voices singing of peace and goodwill. Yet to Miss Marple's ear, the melody sounded almost mournful, as if the village itself sensed that before peace could return, a few more secrets would have to come to light. That evening, the village seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the wind, which had howled across the moors for days, had fallen silent, as though it too were holding its breath. A soft mist clung to the hedgerows, and the lamps along the main road burned dimly behind a veil of fog. Miss Marple sat by her fire once more, her knitting idle in her lap, her thoughts weaving faster than her needles ever could. The discovery of the notebook had confirmed her growing suspicion, but it had not yet provided the name she needed. The name behind the fear that lingered like frost on every villager's tongue. She had spent the afternoon reviewing the facts as she knew them. Mr. Leonard had discovered a second will that would change the inheritance of the Denham estate. He had intended to reveal it, but was silenced before he could do so. The missing letter, likely a piece of correspondence from Sir Geoffrey himself, had vanished, and whoever possessed it held the key to motive. The glove with Julian Harper's initials had been planted too conveniently, and Miss Marple was now certain it was placed deliberately. But it was Mrs. Trent's reaction, the slight tremor when her brooch had been mentioned, that lingered most vividly in her mind. It was the kind of reaction no guilty person could suppress entirely. There came a gentle tap at her window, followed by a familiar voice. "Miss Marple? It's me, Inspector Craddock. May I come in?" She rose, smiling faintly. "Of course, Inspector. I was just about to make tea. You seem to appear precisely when it's ready." He stepped inside, brushing the mist from his hat. "You've a knack for timing yourself. We've had developments. The Denham maid, Nora, I believe her name is, came forward this evening. She claims Mr. Leonard visited the Denham house the afternoon before he died. He spoke privately with Miss Denham for nearly 20 minutes, then left in great agitation. Later that night, Mrs. Trent also called at the same house. According to the maid, she said it was to deliver a message from the vicarage, but the vicar denies sending one." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Ah, how very curious. Mrs. Trent was at the Denham house and later at the vicarage party. Such a busy lady for Christmas Eve. Lady Craddock nodded grimly. "That's not all. We found fresh footprints by the orchard gate this morning. Small, narrow women's boots. They match the pattern of Mrs. Trent's shoes. I could arrest her on suspicion, but I'd rather be sure first. She's clever, too calm, too composed. If she's guilty, she's thought every step through." Miss Marple stirred her tea absently. "Composure, Inspector, is the armour of the deceitful. A truly innocent woman rarely feels the need to seem composed. She simply is. But if Mrs. Trent went to the Denham house that night, I wonder if she went there only once." Craddock frowned. "You mean she might have returned after the murder?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "A woman who's hidden something dangerous does not sleep easily. She might go back to ensure that her secret remains where she left it, or to remove what could expose her. Tell me, has anyone searched her home properly?" "Not yet. We've no warrant." "Then," Miss Marple said, rising and taking her shawl from the chair, "perhaps we might pay a friendly visit. After all, Christmas is a time for calling on one's neighbours." They set out together, the lane slick beneath their feet, the mist thick enough to blur the light of the vicarage behind them. When they reached Mrs. Trent's house, they found her drawing-room window lit and the curtains slightly parted. Through the narrow gap, Miss Marple could see her silhouette moving briskly about the room. A fire burned in the hearth, and beside it stood a small wooden box, half open on the table. Mrs. Trent was bent over it, her hands working quickly. "She's burning something," Craddock whispered. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Then it seems we've arrived just in time." He moved to the front door and knocked sharply. There was a pause, longer than politeness would allow, before Mrs. Trent appeared, her face pale and tight. "Inspector! Miss Marple! What a surprise! I do hope we're not intruding," Miss Marple said with gentle sweetness. "It's such a dreadful business, and I thought perhaps you'd prefer some company. Grief can be quite lonely." Mrs. Trent hesitated, then stepped aside. "Not at all. Please come in." The warmth of the fire struck them immediately, mingled with the acrid scent of burning paper. Craddock's gaze flicked toward the hearth. A few charred fragments were visible among the flames. Mrs. Trent noticed his glance and smiled faintly. Just old letters, Inspector. Sentimental clutter. One can't keep everything forever." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Oh, but one often keeps the wrong things, don't you find? Sentiment is a curious trap." Mrs. Trent's composure wavered for just a moment before she recovered herself. "You're very right, Miss Marple, but really you mustn't think me suspicious. I've been quite beside myself with nerves. I thought a good fire would help settle me." "Of course," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair as though she intended to stay. "Tell me, my dear, did you know Sir Geoffrey Denham well?" Mrs. Trent's eyes flickered toward the flames. "I told you before, I hardly knew him." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I remember. Only I was thinking of that lovely brooch of yours. The bird in flight. Such a beautiful symbol. Freedom, isn't it? It must have meant quite a lot to you." There was a long silence. The clock ticked faintly on the mantelpiece. Then Mrs. Trent said very quietly, "He was a generous man. I was young then, foolish. It was nothing serious." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly. "Nothing serious, except perhaps to a man with no heir, and a woman clever enough to think she might become one. I imagine it would be rather inconvenient if that affair were written into a second will." Mrs. Trent's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "You have no proof?" "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but Mr. Leonard did, and that, I think, was what frightened you most." Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "We'll have to see what's left of those sentimental letters in the fireplace." Mrs. Trent's mask broke then. She turned suddenly toward the hearth, as though to reach into the flames, but Craddock was faster. He caught her wrist. The fire flared, crackling, and one half-burned envelope slid free onto the rug. Miss Marple bent and retrieved it delicately. The writing on the front was unmistakable. "To Eleanor Trent, with my enduring affection, G. Denham." There was a long silence. The ticking of the clock grew loud. Mrs. Trent's shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "He threatened me, said he'd show the will to Hawthorne, that everything would come out. I only meant to frighten him, but he struggled, and the gun went off. I panicked. I hid it in the orchard. I thought if they suspected Harper—" Her voice broke, and she sank into the chair by the fire. Miss Marple's expression held no triumph, only quiet understanding. "Guilt, my dear, is a poor companion for Christmas. It's better to face the truth while the season still holds forgiveness." Craddock nodded gravely, signalling for his men outside. As they led Mrs. Trent away, Miss Marple stood by the hearth, gazing into the dying fire. The last embers flickered faintly, consuming the remnants of deceit. Outside, the mist was lifting, and for the first time in days the stars shone clear over St. Mary Mead. The night air outside was sharp as glass when Miss Marple stepped out of Mrs. Trent's house. The mist had thinned, and the stars gleamed faintly between shreds of cloud. Behind her, the muffled sound of voices carried from within. The constables murmuring, the scrape of boots on the floorboards, and Mrs. Trent's low, broken confession repeating itself like an echo. Inspector Craddock had remained inside to oversee the formalities, but Miss Marple preferred the quiet. She stood at the gate for a moment, drawing her shawl close around her shoulders, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold. Though the case had reached what appeared to be its conclusion, a faint unease still pressed at the edges of her mind, a small, stubborn voice whispering that something was amiss. She began to walk home along the lane, her steps slow and deliberate. The snow crunched beneath her shoes, and the scent of wood smoke drifted from the vicarage chimney. Most of the village slept, its windows dark and still, yet one or two glowed dimly, small sanctuaries of light against the chill. She thought of Mrs. Trent's tear-streaked face, of the way she had clutched the edge of the hearth as she confessed. It had been convincing, undeniably so, and yet there had been one detail, a small one. But Miss Marple trusted small things, the kind of detail that most people forgot, but that truth never did. Mrs. Trent had said she hid the pistol in the orchard, yet she had spoken as though she had done so alone, in the dark, in panic. But Miss Marple knew the orchard gate was stiff with rust. It groaned loudly, even in daylight. Someone would have heard it, and Mrs. Trent, with her delicate constitution and tendency toward nerves, was not the sort of woman to venture out into the night, dragging a guilty conscience behind her. No, someone had helped her, willingly or otherwise, and that meant the story was not yet complete. When Miss Marple reached her cottage, the fire had burned low. She rekindled it gently, sitting down once more with her thoughts. It was nearing midnight when she heard another knock at the door. She opened it to find Inspector Craddock standing there again, looking more tired than before, his breath misting in the cold. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside. Mrs. Trent confessed, said she fired the shot by accident and planted the glove to frame Harper. "We found the pistol exactly where she said, buried beneath the roots of an apple tree. Case closed as far as I'm concerned. Still, I can't say I feel satisfied. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No more do I, Inspector. You see, I've learned that the simplest explanation often hides a second, quieter one beneath it. Mrs. Trent may have fired the shot, but I'm not convinced it was accidental, nor that she acted alone." Craddock frowned. "You think someone else was involved?" "I think," she said softly, "that Mrs. Trent was not quite the mistress of her own decisions. She may have been guided by someone clever enough to use her guilt for their own ends." Craddock rubbed his chin. "Who would that be?" Harper's cleared. Miss Denham had motive, but not opportunity. Mr. Hawthorne's alibi is solid. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Opportunity, Inspector, is not merely a matter of presence. It can be created by suggestion. Mrs. Trent was a proud woman. She might have been persuaded that silencing Leonard was the only way to preserve her reputation, and persuasion in such matters is often more dangerous than a pistol." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You mean someone planted the idea in her mind?" "Exactly, and I think I know who." Before she could say more, there came a hurried knock. It was Mary, the maid, her cheeks flushed from running. "Inspector! Miss Marple! You're needed at the vicarage, Mrs. Grayson. She's fainted. The doctor's with her now." They hurried through the snow to the vicarage, where the drawing-room was in disarray. Mrs. Grayson lay pale and trembling on the sofa, her husband wringing his hands beside her. The doctor looked up as they entered. "Nothing serious," he said. "Shock, perhaps. She was reading a letter when she collapsed." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the table, where an opened envelope lay. The handwriting on it was unfamiliar, but neat. She picked it up delicately. The letter inside was brief. "My dearest, you have nothing to fear. The truth will never reach them. Rest easy. V." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her heart quickened slightly. "V," she murmured. "How very curious." Mrs. Grayson stirred weakly. "It was brought by the post this evening," she whispered. "No return address." "Oh, Miss Marple, I thought it might be from Violet Cummings. She's been such a comfort these past days. But then I saw what it said." "Violet Cummings," Miss Marple repeated softly, her voice almost wistful. "Dear me, she does have a way of comforting people, doesn't she? And of being present precisely where she shouldn't." Craddock stared. "You can't mean Miss Cummings? She's harmless." "Harmless," Miss Marple said gently, "is a word I've never trusted, Inspector. You see, Violet Cummings has been at the edge of every conversation since this began, observing, listening, adding just enough to guide suspicion where she pleased. She told you about Harper near the churchyard, did she not? The perfect story to keep him in the frame. She even visited Mrs. Trent the morning after the murder. She claimed it was to offer sympathy, but I think she went to ensure Mrs. Trent said nothing rash. A whisper here, a reminder there, and Mrs. Trent would have believed she acted alone. But Violet knew the truth. Craddock's eyes widened. And the letter? A reassurance, Miss Marple said simply. Violet must have feared Mrs. Grayson had overheard something, or that guilt might drive her to speak, so she wrote to calm her. Unfortunately for Miss Cummings, she underestimated how the word truth unsettles even the innocent. Before dawn, Craddock and his men brought Violet Cummings in for questioning. At first she laughed off their suspicions with her usual brisk charm, but when presented with the letter, her composure began to crack. By morning she had confessed. She had discovered Mrs. Trent's past affair with Sir Geoffrey months earlier, and used it to manipulate her. She had known about the second will, and feared exposure of her own forgery. She had been altering the parish financial ledgers, siphoning donations for years. Leonard's discovery of the discrepancies had sealed his fate. When it was all over, Craddock found Miss Marple in her garden, brushing snow from the holly bushes. "You were right again," he said, a hint of admiration in his tone. "I should have known there was another layer to it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Evil, Inspector, is very much like good. It prefers to work quietly. But unlike good, it fears exposure. That fear always gives it away." As he left, she returned to her fire and her knitting, the quiet hum of the village returning outside her window. Christmas morning broke clear and cold over St. Mary Mead, and the bells of St. Luke's rang out across the white fields. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving once more, her expression serene. "Human nature," she murmured softly to herself. "So predictable, and yet endlessly surprising." Christmas morning dawned crisp and pale, the air carrying that peculiar stillness that follows great disturbance, as though the village itself were holding its breath in the aftermath of revelation. St. Mary Mead had awakened to sunlight glinting off frosted rooftops, the church bells tolling cheerfully across fields still blanketed in snow. To the ordinary passer-by, it might have seemed a picture of peace and festivity. Yet beneath the calm exterior, whispers still ran like hidden streams. The murder of Mr. Leonard had shaken even the most stoic villagers, and though arrests had been made and confessions extracted, an unease lingered, as if some faint shadow, still waited to be seen. Miss Marple felt it most keenly that morning. She had attended the Christmas service, of course, sitting in her customary pew, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. The sermon was gentle, full of forgiveness and renewal, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. On human frailty, on how easily sin disguised itself as necessity, and how even the mildest people could turn dangerous when cornered. After the service, she lingered a moment by the lych gate, exchanging polite greetings. Mrs. Grayson, though pale, had regained her composure and insisted that she and the vicar would still host their modest Christmas luncheon. It was, she said tremulously, what Leonard would have wished. Inspector Craddock, who had remained in the village overnight to finalize matters, joined Miss Marple as she walked down the snowy lane toward her cottage. "It's over at last," he said, adjusting his scarf. "Cummings will stand trial for conspiracy, and Mrs. Trent's confession corroborates the rest. Hawthorne's already arranged to send the second will to the Crown Court. Justice will be served." Miss Marple gave a small, approving nod. "Yes, Inspector, justice in the legal sense will. But there are other forms of justice, quieter and sometimes harsher. Poor Mrs. Trent, her punishment began the moment she picked up that pistol." Craddock sighed. "You pity her?" "I pity all who act from fear," Miss Marple replied gently. "Their fear is rarely wicked in itself, but it opens the door for wickedness to enter." They parted at the lane's bend, Craddock heading for the inn, and Miss Marple continuing home. Yet as she neared her cottage, she noticed something peculiar. On her doorstep lay a small envelope half buried in snow. She bent to pick it up, brushing away the frost. There was no address, only her name written in a cramped, uneven hand. She recognized it at once. It was Violet Cummings's. Inside, the letter was brief and hurried, the ink smudged as though written in haste. "You see so much, Miss Marple. Too much. They think it's done, but it isn't. There are things you don't know, things that will come out soon. He wasn't the only one who died that night. Forgive me, V." Miss Marple stood quite still, the cold air biting her cheeks. "He wasn't the only one who died that night," she repeated softly. It was not a metaphor, she felt sure of that. Violet's words carried a finality too deliberate for mere dramatics. The woman had been manipulative, calculating, but not insane. And the phrasing, "forgive me," had the unmistakable tone of a farewell. Without hesitation, she turned and made her way to the inn where Craddock was staying. He was at breakfast, his plate untouched, reading over his reports. When Miss Marple handed him the note, his expression darkened. "This was left on your doorstep. When?" "Within the hour, I imagine." The ink was still fresh. Craddock rose at once. "Then she's done something foolish. We've had her under guard at the station in Much Benham since last night. God help us if she's slipped away." Within an hour, confirmation came. Violet Cummings had been found, dead in her cell, having swallowed a vial of arsenic hidden in her clothing. On the table beside her was a second note, longer, more deliberate than the one left for Miss Marple. Its contents, though, were not the confession Craddock had expected. It began with apologies, but ended with accusations, written in that same slanted, trembling hand. "I was not alone. He made me do it. He said they'd find out about the money if Leonard lived. I warned him, but he said a dead man tells no tales. I took the blame because I thought he would protect me. He won't. He's safe now, and I'm beyond safety." Craddock slammed his fist against the table. "There's always another layer, isn't there? She's implicating someone, but who? She doesn't name him." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Oh, but she does, Inspector. Just not directly. She says, he's safe now. Tell me, who in this affair has profited most from Leonard's death and escaped all suspicion?" Craddock frowned. "Hawthorne. No, impossible. He's a respected man, pillar of the community, long-standing solicitor. He gave us every cooperation." "Precisely," Miss Marple murmured. "Too much cooperation can be as suspicious as too little. You'll recall that it was he who confirmed the rumour of the second will. He who told you Leonard was anxious, and speaking of conscience, he framed the story neatly for you, Inspector, just as he framed Violet to ensure silence. You see, if Leonard had produced the real will, Hawthorne's fraud would have been uncovered. He'd forged not just signatures for the estate, but transactions to his own firm's account. Violet discovered it first, and he used her, poor impressionable creature that she was, to handle his dirty work." Craddock stared at her, struck speechless for a moment. "And you think Violet realized she'd been used after his arrest of Mrs. Trent? That's why she wrote to you?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "She understood that she'd been sacrificed, that Hawthorne had manoeuvred every piece into place. The jealous lover, the frightened woman, The false letter. Violet might have been manipulative, but she was never cold-blooded. Once she saw herself as the next disposable pawn, she chose her own ending, but not before leaving us her final message. By midday, Craddock had secured a warrant. The search of Hawthorne's offices yielded what Miss Marple had anticipated: forged entries, letters altered, and hidden behind a panel in his desk, the genuine second will of Sir Geoffrey Denham, the document that Leonard had been killed to suppress. Hawthorne's arrest came quietly, his face pale and his voice calm, almost relieved. "I should have known," he murmured as they led him away, "that nothing escapes Miss Marple." When the commotion had passed and the sun dipped low over the snow-laden fields, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting beside her, the village finally at rest. The bells of evening tolled softly in the distance, and she allowed herself a faint sigh. She thought of Leonard, honest, earnest Leonard, whose only crime had been integrity, and of Violet, who had fallen prey to cleverer evil than her own. Outside, children's laughter echoed faintly as they dragged sleds down the frozen lane, their joy untarnished by the darkness that had passed through the village. Miss Marple smiled faintly at the sound. "How swiftly innocence returns," she murmured. Then, as she reached for her teacup, her gaze lifted toward the window where the first star of the evening trembled against the violet sky. "A Christmas of truth," she whispered. "Not the happiest, perhaps, but the most human." The following days passed in a hush, as if the village itself were catching its breath after a long and dreadful dream. Snow still lay thick upon the lanes, but the festive wreaths had begun to wilt, their bright ribbons dulled by frost. Word of Hawthorne's arrest had spread quickly, and though the villagers discussed it in subdued tones, mostly over tea and scones in the shop or in quiet corners of the post office, the shock had left an unspoken tremor in the air. No one liked to think that such a man, so steady, so respectable, could have harboured deceit for years beneath his courteous smile. Yet, in St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple well knew, wickedness wore the politest faces. For her part, she received no satisfaction in Hawthorne's downfall, only a calm melancholy that always followed her quiet triumphs. The human heart, she often thought, was like the soil after heavy rain. It appeared smooth on the surface, but underneath it was unsettled, waiting for time to reveal what had been disturbed. On the morning after his confession, she took her usual walk through the village. Every person she met seemed eager to speak of the matter, though each pretended they were not. Mrs. Price Ridley, out feeding the birds by her gate, could not resist remarking, "Quite the scandal, isn't it, Miss Marple? That man drew up my will last spring. So obliging, so proper. Imagine, forging papers all the while. I told you, didn't I, that there was something a bit too smooth about him?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Indeed, you did mention it, my dear. I remember you said he complimented your handwriting. A small observation, but a telling one, I dare say." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked, uncertain whether she was being agreed with or subtly corrected, and Miss Marple went on her way. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots as she walked toward the churchyard. There, the low winter sun cast long shadows across the headstones, and a faint mist hung between the trees. She paused by the newer graves, familiar names, familiar stories. and then by the space where soon Mr. Leonard would be laid to rest. It was a quiet spot, beside the path that led to the orchard beyond. The sight of it filled her with both sadness and reflection. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You've a habit of being where the truth settles, Miss Marple." She turned to find Inspector Craddock approaching, his hat in his hand, his expression weary but softened by relief. "I suppose it's all finished now," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Hawthorne's given a full statement. He confessed to altering the Denham will years ago, funneling the estate's interest into his own accounts. Leonard discovered it, threatened to expose him. Hawthorne used Violet Cummings to divert suspicion, played her emotions like a fiddle. When she grew frightened, he promised protection he never meant to give. A clever man, too clever by half." Miss Marple nodded. "Cleverness without conscience always ends the same way, Inspector. It undoes itself in the end. The clever may conceal a lie, but they can never disguise the emptiness it leaves behind." Craddock sighed. "You make it sound almost poetic. Life is poetic, Inspector. Murder, too, in its dreadful fashion." They stood together a moment in silence, watching a robin dart across the snow to perch upon a cross of stone. "What will become of Mrs. Trent?" Craddock asked quietly. "She'll face her trial," Miss Marple said, "but she will not hang. The law has mercy for those who act under fear and manipulation. I rather think she will find peace one day, of a sort. It may be slow in coming, but peace has a way of finding the repentant." Craddock looked at her with genuine admiration. "You've a kind heart, Miss Marple. Most would simply call her guilty." "Oh, but she is guilty," Miss Marple said softly. "Only, you see, guilt is rarely a single thread. It binds itself to others, love, pride, desperation. Pull one, and the whole thing unravels." Craddock smiled faintly. "You make my work sound like embroidery." "Of a kind," she replied, her eyes twinkling, "though I find human nature a far more delicate fabric than any I've ever handled." They left the churchyard together, the inspector walking her back toward her cottage. Along the way, they passed the vicarage, where Mrs. Grayson waved from the window. Inside, a small Christmas tree still stood, its candles unlit, a quiet memorial to the gathering that had begun this dreadful tale. As they reached her gate, Miss Marple paused. "You'll be returning to London soon, I imagine?" "Tomorrow morning," Craddock said. "I can't say I'll miss the cold, but I'll miss this village a little, though I dare say it's never quite the peaceful place it pretends to be." She laughed softly. "Peaceful, Inspector, but never dull. You mustn't mistake quiet for calm. Beneath every thatched roof here there are stories, some told, most hidden." Craddock tipped his hat. "If there's ever another of those hidden stories, I expect you'll find it before I do." "I should hope so," she said. "One must keep one's mind occupied at my age." When he had gone, Miss Marple lingered by her gate, watching the snow begin to fall again, fine and light as ash. It settled on the branches and rooftops, softening the world back into innocence. She thought of Leonard's honesty, Violet's misdirected cunning, Hawthorne's cold intelligence, and Mrs. Trent's fatal weakness. Each had played their part in the tragedy, each revealing something painfully familiar. Later that evening, she sat once more by her fire. The room glowed warmly, the ticking of the clock the only sound. Outside, the church bell struck 6. She took up her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she worked. On the mantelpiece stood a small card, sent that morning by Inspector Craddock. a simple note of gratitude, signed with warm regards. As she knitted, her mind wandered, not to the crime itself, which was finished, but to the deeper puzzle that always followed such events. Human beings, she reflected, were endlessly complex creatures, each one capable of both kindness and cruelty. Yet somehow life continued. Gardens would bloom again. Tea would be poured. Gossip would resume. That was the strange mercy of the world. It mended itself, just enough to go on. She looked out through her window one last time, before drawing the curtains. The village lay still beneath its fresh blanket of snow, peaceful at last. Somewhere in the distance, faint voices were singing, children perhaps, rehearsing carols for Twelfth Night. The melody drifted softly through the air, pure and untroubled. Miss Marple smiled, set her knitting aside, and folded her hands in her lap. Another Christmas ended, she whispered, and as ever, the world remains both better and worse than it was before. But at least, she added with a glint of quiet amusement, one must never complain of boredom in St. Mary Mead. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and outside, the snow continued to fall, silent, steady, and forgiving, as if even nature wished to draw a gentle curtain over the sins of mankind. The turn of the year came quietly to St. Mary Mead. The snow had begun to melt, revealing damp earth and muddy lanes where children once again played, their laughter echoing through the crisp winter air. The village was returning to itself, resuming its steady rhythm of small gossip, polite visits and church meetings, as though the tragedy that had darkened Christmas were being carefully folded away like an unpleasant memory. But for Miss Marple, memory was not something so easily tidied. She believed the past never truly left. It only lingered in softer tones, whispering reminders to those willing to listen. The morning of Twelfth Night found her in her garden, trimming the frost-bitten branches from her rose bushes. The sky was pale, the kind that promised more snow before spring. She worked slowly, her thoughts as steady as her hands. Behind her, the faint creak of the gate announced a visitor. When she turned, she found Colonel Melrose standing there, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically thoughtful. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Colonel," she replied, straightening with a small smile. "You've come to tell me something, haven't you? You always do when you look like that." He chuckled, though without much humour. "You know me too well, madam. It's about the Denham estate. They've finished sorting through Hawthorne's papers. Seems the scoundrel was deeper in his dealings than anyone suspected. He'd been diverting funds from not one, but 3 estates over the years. Clever fellow. Used forged signatures, dummy accounts, even dead men's names. The Crown's men found it all in a hidden ledger behind his office safe." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, clipping another branch. "I did think he seemed a bit too organized. Men who take such pride in neatness often do so because chaos frightens them, and because they have something to hide beneath it." Melrose nodded. "You've the right of it. What's remarkable, though, is that most of the missing money was never recovered. They think he must have moved it somewhere long before the arrest." He hesitated, glancing at her with a curious expression. "You wouldn't happen to have a theory about that as well, would you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A theory, perhaps. I expect the money's where it's always been, hidden in plain sight, in some respectable account under a borrowed name. Such men never bury their sins far from home. They like to keep them where they can look upon them with pride." The Colonel gave a low whistle. "You know, sometimes I think Scotland Yard should just make you Honorary Chief Inspector." She laughed softly. "Oh no, Colonel, I should never do. The uniform wouldn't suit me, and besides, one learns more by sitting quietly at the edge of things. People forget you're there, and that's when they reveal themselves. He stayed a while longer, discussing the village's slow recovery, before taking his leave. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back to her garden. A robin perched nearby, cocking its head as if listening. "Yes," she said gently, "the world does go on, doesn't it? Even after such dreadful business." That evening, as the last of the daylight faded, she received another visitor, Mrs. Grayson, wrapped in a thick shawl, her eyes weary but kind. "I do hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple. It's only I wanted to thank you. If not for you, we might never have known the truth. The village owes you more than it realizes." Miss Marple motioned her to sit by the fire. "You're very kind, my dear, but I only listened. The truth was there all along, hiding in people's voices, in the things they didn't say." Mrs. Grayson clasped her hands. "It was all so dreadful, and at Christmas of all times. I can't bear to think of poor Mr. Leonard. Such a good soul. And Violet Cummings. I confess, I pitied her in the end." "As did I," Miss Marple said softly. "She was not wicked by nature, only weak, and weakness in the wrong hands can be as dangerous as malice. Hawthorne knew that. He used her fears, her vanity, and her loneliness as tools. It's what evil does best. It corrupts what's already fragile." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle. Then Mrs. Grayson said, "Do you ever tire of it, Miss Marple? Seeing the worst in people, I mean." Miss Marple looked into the flames, her expression thoughtful. "Oh, I don't see the worst, my dear. I see the whole. People are rarely entirely good or bad. They're simply human, full of contradictions. I've lived long enough to understand that every heart is capable of both kindness and cruelty. What matters is which we choose when we're tested." Mrs. Grayson smiled faintly. "You always make things sound so simple." "Truth usually is," Miss Marple replied. "It's people who make it complicated." After Mrs. Grayson had gone, the cottage grew quiet once more. Miss Marple rose, drawing the curtains against the cold, and stood for a moment by the window. Across the lane, the lights in the vicarage glowed warmly, and faint laughter drifted through the air. The first sound of genuine cheer since that fateful night. She smiled, feeling a soft contentment settle over her. Yet even as peace returned, her mind lingered on the deeper lessons the case had offered. It was not the murder itself that troubled her now, but the fragility of truth. The way it could so easily be twisted or concealed by those clever enough to wear virtue like a mask. She thought of Hawthorne, calm and polite even in confession, of Mrs. Trent, broken by fear, and of Violet, desperate for forgiveness she never truly sought. They were not monsters, merely people who had lost sight of right and wrong, step by step, until there was no turning back, no turning back, no. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the hearth and resumed her knitting. The pattern was delicate, white wool on silver needles, a design she'd been meaning to finish since before Christmas. As the firelight danced across the yarn, she found herself humming softly, a tune she remembered from long ago, something her grandmother used to sing on winter evenings just like this. Outside, the snow began again, falling in light, steady flakes that brushed against the window like whispers. The clock chimed 9, its sound deep and familiar. Miss Marple paused her knitting, gazing into the fire. The case of the Christmas Eve murder had drawn to its inevitable end, but the story of human frailty, she knew, would never truly conclude. There would always be another secret, another deception, another soul undone by pride or fear, and she, quiet and unassuming as she seemed, would always be there to notice. She smiled then, softly, wisely, and with that peculiar gentleness that came from knowing too much about the world to despair of it. Yes, she murmured to herself, life does go on. And thank heavens it does, or what on earth would I do with my evenings? The fire crackled warmly. The wind whispered beyond the cottage walls, and the snow fell thicker, wrapping St. Mary Mead once more in its soft white silence, pure and cold like the truth itself, waiting patiently for the next curious soul to uncover it. The snow had ceased at last, leaving the village washed clean beneath a pale winter sun. The rooftops gleamed white, and the trees glittered as though draped in crystal. The church bell tolled softly in the distance, signalling Epiphany. A fitting day, Miss Marple thought, for revelations and quiet reckonings. She sat at her breakfast table, the newspaper folded neatly beside her teacup. The headlines had already moved on, speaking of politics and distant troubles. Only a small column near the bottom of the page mentioned the resolution of the Christmas Eve murder, written in the bland, factual tone the press reserved for things it could not quite understand. Local solicitor convicted of fraud and accessory to murder. Mr. Gerald Hawthorne sentenced to life imprisonment. Accomplice's suicide closes case. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully, as one might close a well-read book. Outside, she could hear the faint murmur of the milkman's cart and the laughter of schoolchildren, proof that life was continuing exactly as it should. And yet, for her, the story was not entirely finished. Not until she had turned over every stone in her mind and found all that lay beneath. A knock came at the door. It was Inspector Craddock once again, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, but his eyes kind. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I thought I'd drop by before heading back to London. I wanted to thank you properly. Thank me," she said with a smile, ushering him inside. "My dear Inspector, I did nothing but listen and knit. You're the one who braved the cold and the paperwork." Craddock chuckled. "You make it sound simple, but you've an instinct no man at the Yard could match. Without your insights, Hawthorne might have walked free. And to think, you suspected him before there was a shred of proof." Miss Marple poured him tea and replied mildly, "Proof, Inspector, is often just a matter of patience. I've learned that people reveal themselves if one lets them speak long enough. Hawthorne was too eager to help, too precise in his recollections. He told the truth where it didn't matter, and lied where it did. I've seen the same pattern in gossiping spinsters and dishonest gardeners alike." Craddock laughed softly. "You make villainy sound almost domestic." "Oh, but it is," she said, stirring her tea. "Most wickedness begins in the home, over tea-tables and family quarrels, in the small selfish acts no one notices. The grand crimes merely grow out of them, like weeds from untended soil." He nodded thoughtfully. "You've a way of seeing the world that makes even a murder seem understandable, not forgivable," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But understandable, yes. We are none of us immune to folly, Inspector. The difference lies only in how far we let it lead us." They spoke for a while longer of the village, the thawing weather, and the small absurdities of human nature. When at last Craddock rose to leave, he turned at the door. "I don't suppose you'll ever retire from detection, Miss Marple. Even when there's no mystery left, you'll find one, won't you?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "One doesn't find mysteries, Inspector. They simply happen to appear, rather like weeds in springtime, and someone must see to them." When he had gone, she stood for a moment at the window, watching the lane where his car disappeared into the distance. The sunlight caught the melting snow, and tiny rivulets of water ran down the thatch of the neighbouring cottage, glittering like tears. Miss Marple thought of all the lives touched by the events of that Christmas Eve. Mrs. Trent, seeking redemption through confession. Violet Cummings, consumed by guilt and loneliness. Poor Leonard, whose honesty had cost him his life. And even Hawthorne, brilliant but soulless, undone by his own arrogance. It struck her, as it often did, that evil seldom arrives with thunder or blood. More often it comes quietly, wrapped in good manners, concealed behind polite smiles. It is allowed to grow because no one wants to look too closely. But she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, had spent her life looking closely, and for all its sadness, she was grateful for that. She tidied away her breakfast things, lit the fire, and took up her knitting. The day ahead was hers to fill, and already she could hear the faint hum of the village resuming its chatter. Mrs. Price Ridley would be stopping by to ask whether the vicar's sermon had been a touch too long, and the postmistress would have a new rumour about the butcher's assistant. Life was returning to its ordinary pattern, and that, Miss Marple thought, was the greatest mystery of all, how swiftly humanity learned to mend itself, to move from grief to gossip, from tragedy back to tea. As the fire crackled and the kettle began to hum, she smiled to herself, a small knowing smile that belonged to no one else in the world. People, she murmured softly, are infinitely strange, but then, so is grace. Outside, the last of the snow melted from the church spire, and the bells began to ring for morning prayers. Their sound carried over the rooftops, through the quiet streets, and into the little sitting room where Miss Marple sat, serene and watchful, her needles moving in gentle rhythm. Another mystery had ended, but life, complex, curious, and ever unpredictable, was only beginning again.